Victoria Harrison stepped off the private jet, her designer heels clicking against the worn tarmac of the small, provincial airport. The contrast between her polished appearance and the bleak surroundings was stark. She wrinkled her nose at the sight of the old, battered pickup trucks parked haphazardly along the fence, their owners chatting leisurely as if they had all the time in the world. It was a world away from the gleaming towers of Manhattan, where time was money, and she was a princess in a kingdom of glass and steel. But that was before everything changed. She barely glanced at the driver holding a sign with her name. Harrison. It read in block letters, as if she could ever be mistaken for anyone else. Victoria had grown accustomed to the envious glances, the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Her father, Michael Harrison, was a titan of Wall Street, and she had been raised to rule by his side. Private schools, luxury vacations, and designer wardrobes were all she had ever known. She had always been the best, the brightest, and she had never doubted her place at the top. Until now. "Miss Harrison?" the driver asked hesitantly as he approached. He was a middle-aged man with a kind face, wearing a jacket that had seen better days. His eyes flickered with a mixture of curiosity and concern. This was not the kind of place where someone like Victoria belonged. "That's me," she replied curtly, not bothering to hide her irritation. "Let's get this over with." The drive to the town was uncomfortable. The roads were narrow, winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around them. Victoria stared out the window, her mind racing with anger and resentment. This was her father's doing, his twisted way of teaching her a lesson. After the last disastrous business meeting, where her arrogance had nearly cost the Harrison empire a fortune, Michael had made it clear. She was out of control. But instead of the usual scolding or a silent dinner, he had done the unthinkable. He had exiled her. "Time to learn what the real world is like, Victoria," he had said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "You need to understand the value of hard work and humility. You'll be staying in Rockport, Maine, until I decide you're ready to come back." The words echoed in her mind as the car pulled into the town of Rockport. It was smaller than she had imagined, a sleepy place with narrow streets and quaint shops, most of which seemed to be closed. There were no skyscrapers, no bustling crowds, nothing that even remotely resembled the world she was used to. "Welcome to Rockport," the driver said, trying to sound cheerful. "It's a quiet town, but folks here are friendly. You'll get used to it." Victoria didn't answer. She couldn't imagine ever getting used to this place. They stopped in front of a small, weathered building with a sign that read, "The Cozy Bean Coffee." Victoria's new workplace. The plan was simple. She would live in a modest apartment above the coffee and work there as a barista, earning minimum wage. Her father had cut off her access to her trust fund and credit cards, leaving her with just enough cash to get by. She was expected to fend for herself, to survive like everyone else. The coffee's owner, a woman in her late 40s with a warm smile, greeted her at the door. "You must be Victoria," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Nancy. I own the place. Come on in. Let's get you settled." Victoria hesitated, then shook Nancy's hand, feeling the roughness of her palm. This woman had probably worked hard her whole life, building this business from the ground up. It was a concept entirely foreign to Victoria, who had never had to work for anything. Inside, the coffee was cozy, with mismatched furniture and the smell of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. A few locals sat at the tables, chatting quietly. They glanced up as Victoria entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and surprise. "This will be your new home," Nancy said, leading Victoria to a small staircase in the back. "Your apartment is upstairs. It's not much, but it's clean and comfortable." Victoria followed silently, her mind racing. She was used to penthouses, not small-town apartments. But as she looked around, she realized she had no choice. She was stuck here until her father decided otherwise. After showing her the apartment, a modest, one-bedroom space with minimal furnishings, Nancy left Victoria to settle in. Victoria dropped her suitcase on the floor and sat on the bed, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on her. How had it come to this? How had she, Victoria Harrison, fallen so far? But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, a new emotion began to creep in. Beneath the anger and resentment, there was something else, a flicker of curiosity. For the first time in her life, Victoria was alone, truly alone, without her father's influence or her wealth to shield her. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to be learned here, something that could help her climb back to the top. But not yet. Not today. Today, she would wallow in her misery and plan her escape. Tomorrow, she would begin to figure out this strange, foreign world where she had been exiled, and she would prove to her father and to herself that she was still a Harrison, destined to rule, no matter where she was. The next morning, the sound of an alarm clock blaring at 6 a.m. jolted Victoria awake. She slapped the snooze button with a groan, squinting at the unfamiliar room around her. The reality of her situation came crashing down again, but there was no escaping it. She had to get up, get dressed, and face her new life. Victoria dragged herself out of bed and glanced in the mirror. Her reflection looked back at her with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Gone were the perfectly styled hair and immaculate makeup that she used to sport every day. Instead, she saw a young woman who looked out of place and utterly lost. She threw on a simple outfit, jeans and a plain sweater, items she would never have worn back in New York. After a quick attempt to tame her hair, she headed downstairs to the coffee, where Nancy was already bustling about, preparing for the morning rush. "Good morning, Victoria." Nancy greeted her with a smile as she wiped down the counter. "Ready for your first day?" Victoria forced a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, trying to hide the sarcasm in her voice. "That's the spirit," Nancy said, either not noticing or choosing to ignore Victoria's tone. "Let me show you the ropes." For the next hour, Victoria followed Nancy around the coffee, learning how to brew coffee, make lattes, and take orders. It was all so mundane. The customers trickled in slowly at first, mostly older locals who seemed to know Nancy by name. They chatted with her, sharing stories about their families, their gardens, or the weather. Victoria couldn't help but feel like an outsider, a feeling that only deepened as the morning wore on. Around mid-morning, the doors swung open, and a tall man in his late 20s walked in. He had an easygoing smile, dark hair tousled in a way that suggested he didn't care much about appearances, and a rugged look that seemed to fit perfectly with the small-town vibe. He made his way to the counter, nodding at Nancy before turning his attention to Victoria. "Hey, you must be the new girl," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "I'm Luke, one of the regulars here." Victoria nodded, trying to maintain her composure. "Victoria," she replied curtly, hoping he would get the message that she wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Victoria, huh?" Luke repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "So, what brings a city girl like you to Rockport?" "My father's idea," Victoria said, her tone clipped. "He thinks I need to learn some life lessons." Luke chuckled, clearly amused by her response. "Well, Rockport's not a bad place to do that. People here are pretty nice, once you get to know them." "I'll take your word for it," Victoria muttered, turning away to focus on the next order. She didn't need any advice from some small-town guy who probably didn't even know what a real problem looked like. But Luke wasn't so easily dissuaded. "You know, this town's got more to offer than you might think," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "There's a lot of history here, and the folks who live here have some pretty interesting stories." Victoria rolled her eyes. "I'm sure they do." Nancy, who had been listening quietly, stepped in with a smile. "Luke's right, Victoria. Rockport may be small, but it has its charm. You might even find you like it here, if you give it a chance." Victoria didn't respond. She wasn't interested in hearing about the town's so-called charm. All she wanted was to serve her time here and get back to the life she knew, the life she deserved. The morning continued much the same, with Victoria fumbling through orders and trying to avoid the curious glances from the regulars. Every interaction felt awkward, and every minute seemed to drag on endlessly. She was used to making quick decisions, closing deals, and moving on to the next challenge. But here, everything moved at a slower pace, and it was driving her insane. By lunchtime, Victoria was ready to snap. She had spilled coffee on herself twice, forgotten a customer's order, and nearly knocked over a tray of pastries. She was used to being in control, but here, She felt like she was constantly on the verge of losing it. As the clock crept toward 1 p.m., Nancy noticed Victoria's frustration. "Why don't you take a break, Victoria?" she suggested gently. "There's a little park just down the street where you can get some fresh air. Clear your head." Victoria didn't need to be told twice. She nodded stiffly, untied her apron, and headed for the door. The moment she stepped outside, she took a deep breath, savoring the cool, crisp air. The streets of Rockport were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. It was a stark contrast to the constant noise and chaos of Manhattan. As she walked toward the park, Victoria couldn't help but reflect on how surreal this all felt. A few days ago, she had been sitting in a high-rise office, surrounded by people who respected her, maybe even feared her. Now, she was just another face in a small town where no one cared about her last name or her pedigree. When she reached the park, she found a bench near a cluster of trees and sat down, closing her eyes for a moment. The sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze were almost soothing. Almost. But as she sat there, trying to clear her mind, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Victoria opened her eyes to find an elderly woman sitting on the bench next to her. The woman had a kind smile and bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through Victoria's carefully constructed facade. Yeah," Victoria replied, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to random strangers striking up conversations with her, especially not in a park. "I'm Margaret," the woman said, extending a hand. "I've lived in Rockport all my life. It's always nice to see new faces around here." Victoria shook her hand, feeling a bit off balance. "Victoria," she said, trying to keep the conversation short. "Victoria," Margaret repeated with a nod. "That's a lovely name. It suits you." "Thanks," Victoria mumbled, unsure of what else to say. Margaret studied her for a moment, then said, "You don't seem too happy to be here." Victoria couldn't help but laugh, though there was little humor in it. "That's an understatement." Margaret smiled sympathetically. "Rockport isn't for everyone, but it has a way of growing on you. Give it time." "That's what everyone keeps telling me," Victoria muttered, more to herself than to Margaret. The older woman didn't seem offended by Victoria's tone. Instead, she leaned back on the bench and looked out at the park. "I've seen a lot of people come and go from this town. Some leave and never look back, but others, well, they find something here they didn't even know they were looking for." Victoria remained silent, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't looking for anything in this town. She was just biding her time until she could return to her real life. But as Margaret continued to talk, sharing stories about the town and its people, Victoria found herself listening. There was something about the way Margaret spoke, something that made her feel less like an outsider and more like someone who could, eventually, belong. When the conversation finally lulled, Margaret stood up. "I should be going," she said with a smile. "It was nice talking to you, Victoria. I hope you find what you're looking for." Victoria watched as Margaret walked away, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but for the first time since she had arrived in Rockport, she didn't feel completely alone. Maybe this place wasn't so terrible after all. With a sigh, Victoria stood up and began walking back to the coffee. She still had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let this town, or anyone in it, get the better of her. Not yet. Victoria returned to the coffee with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt earlier. The walk through the park and the unexpected conversation with Margaret had given her a moment of clarity, a brief respite from the storm of emotions that had been brewing since her arrival in Rockport. But as she pushed open the door of the Cozy Bean Coffee, the warm aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries greeted her, and the reality of her situation came rushing back. Nancy was behind the counter, chatting with a customer. A young woman who looked like she had just come from a yoga class, dressed in leggings and a tank top, her hair tied up in a messy bun. They both turned to look at Victoria as she entered, and Nancy smiled warmly. "Feeling better?" Nancy asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "Yeah," Victoria replied, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Thanks for letting me take a break." "Of course," Nancy said, waving off the thanks as if it were unnecessary. "You're doing great for your first day, Victoria. It's a lot to take in, I know, but you're getting the hang of it." Victoria wasn't so sure about that, but she nodded anyway. The truth was, she still felt completely out of her depth. Every task, every interaction, felt like a reminder of how far she had fallen from the life she once knew. But she had to keep going. There was no other option. As the afternoon wore on, the coffee started to fill up with the lunchtime crowd. Victoria found herself busier than ever, juggling orders, cleaning tables, and trying to keep up with Nancy's steady pace. It was exhausting, and by the time the clock struck 3 p.m., she was ready to collapse. Just as she was about to take a breather, the door opened, and in walked Luke, the same guy who had tried to make small talk earlier. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of people followed him, men and women around his age, all dressed casually and laughing as they entered. They took over a large table near the window, their energy filling the small space. "Hey, Victoria," Luke called out, waving her over with a grin. "Can we get some service over here?" Victoria rolled her eyes but made her way to the table, pen and notepad in hand. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone businesslike. Luke leaned back in his chair, still smiling. "Let's see. I'll have a black coffee, and these guys will have..." He looked around at his friends, who began rattling off their orders, a mix of coffees, sandwiches, and pastries. As Victoria scribbled down the orders, one of the women at the table, a brunette with a mischievous smile, leaned forward. "So, you're the new girl in town, huh? What brings you to our little slice of heaven?" Victoria straightened up, meeting the woman's gaze. "Just needed a change of scenery," she replied, keeping her answer vague. She wasn't about to spill her life story to a bunch of strangers. "Well, you picked the right place," the woman said with a wink. "Rockport has a way of surprising people." Victoria forced a smile, then turned to head back to the counter, her mind already focused on getting their order ready. But as she walked away, she couldn't help but overhear their conversation continuing behind her. "She's got that city vibe, doesn't she?" one of the men remarked, chuckling. "Yeah, I bet she's used to having people wait on her hand and foot," another woman added, her tone playful but with an edge. Luke's voice cut through the chatter. "Come on, guys, give her a break. We don't know her story." Victoria's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She hated the idea that they were talking about her, judging her, without knowing anything about who she really was. But then again, she realized, wasn't that exactly what she had been doing to them? Judging this town, its people, without giving them a fair chance? She pushed the thought aside and focused on her work, determined to get through the rest of the day without another misstep. As the afternoon stretched on, Victoria found herself falling into a rhythm. The coffee had started to feel less foreign, the tasks less daunting. There was something oddly satisfying about the simplicity of the work, taking orders, making coffee, chatting briefly with customers. It was so different from the high-stakes world she had come from, yet there was a strange comfort in the routine. Around 4 p.m., the coffee had quieted down, and Victoria finally had a moment to catch her breath. She was wiping down the counter when Nancy came over, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You're doing really well, Victoria," Nancy said softly. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you're handling it better than most people would." Victoria paused, looking at Nancy with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Thanks," she said quietly. "I'm trying." Nancy nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "You know, I've seen a lot of people come and go through this coffee. Some stay, some leave, but everyone who comes through those doors brings a little something different. And you have potential, Victoria, more than you realize." Victoria wasn't sure how to respond to that. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her like that, with such sincerity and belief in her abilities. She wasn't used to it, and it left her feeling both vulnerable and oddly empowered. Before she could say anything, the door opened again, and Victoria turned to see who it was. A man stepped inside, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He looked around the coffee before his gaze landed on Victoria. For a moment, their eyes met, and a strange chill ran down her spine. There was something about him, something unsettling that she couldn't quite put her finger on. He was out of place, just like she was, but in a different way. His presence felt like a shadow creeping into the warmth of the coffee. "Can I help you?" Victoria asked, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. The man didn't answer right away. He walked slowly toward the counter, his movements deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Just a coffee. Black." Victoria nodded, quickly preparing the order. As she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt the chill again. The man gave her a curt nod, then turned and walked out, leaving a $20 bill on the counter. Nancy came over, her brow furrowed. Who was that? Victoria shook her head, watching the man disappear down the street. "I don't know," she replied, the words feeling heavier than they should have. But as she stood there, staring at the door he had just walked through, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she had just encountered something, or someone, that would change everything. And for the first time since arriving in Rockport, she felt a flicker of fear, not just for herself, but for the town she had so quickly dismissed. Something was coming, something that would tear down the walls she had built around herself, forcing her to confront not only the mystery lurking beneath the surface of this quiet town, but also the person she truly was. And she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The unease from the stranger's visit lingered with Victoria as she closed up the coffee that evening. The streets of Rockport were nearly deserted, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of cars and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The once cozy town now seemed cloaked in an unsettling silence, one that gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Nancy had left earlier, trusting Victoria to handle the last hour alone. It was a small town, after all, where crime was nearly unheard of and everyone knew each other. But Victoria couldn't shake the image of the man with the baseball cap, his shadowy presence still vivid in her mind. As she locked the front door and turned to head upstairs to her apartment, a soft creak echoed through the coffee. Victoria froze, her hand still on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the dimly lit room, her eyes narrowing as she tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, forcing her feet to move. "It's an old building. Old buildings make noise." But even as she tried to rationalize it, the unease only deepened. She hurried up the stairs, turning on every light as she went, the brightness a small comfort against the growing darkness outside. Inside her apartment, Victoria quickly locked the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as she took a deep breath. The apartment felt small and confining, the walls too close, the air too still. She wandered into the tiny living room, where the bare walls and sparse furniture only added to the sense of isolation. She tried to distract herself by unpacking the few belongings she had brought with her. Clothes, a couple of books, her laptop, things that had once been part of a much grander life. But now, they felt like remnants of a world she was no longer a part of. As she arranged her clothes in the narrow closet, Victoria's thoughts drifted back to the stranger in the coffee. Who was he? What was he doing in Rockport? And why had he looked at her like that? As if he knew something she didn't. She shook her head, trying to push the questions away. It was probably nothing, just some drifter passing through town. But even as she tried to convince herself, a part of her couldn't let it go. Victoria glanced at the clock, 9:30 p.m. It was early, but exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. She decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would bring some relief from the uneasy thoughts circling in her mind. But sleep didn't come easily. Victoria tossed and turned, the stranger's face flashing in her mind every time she closed her eyes. She kept imagining the way his gaze had lingered on her, the coldness in his voice as he ordered his coffee. There had been something off about him, something that set her instincts on edge. Finally, after what felt like hours, she managed to drift off, but her sleep was restless, plagued by unsettling dreams. She found herself back in the coffee, but it wasn't the cozy place she had come to know. The lights were flickering, the tables overturned, and shadows moved along the walls, whispering her name. Victoria ran from room to room, searching for something or someone. But every door she opened led to another dark, empty space. And then she heard it, a soft, sinister laugh echoing through the hallways, growing louder and louder until it filled her ears. She turned around, and there he was, the man from the coffee, standing in the doorway, his face obscured by shadows. He took a step toward her, and Victoria tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was frozen, trapped in the nightmare, as the man reached out to grab her. Suddenly, Victoria jolted awake, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She sat up in bed, clutching the sheets as she looked around the dark room. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that it took her a moment to remember where she was. It's just a dream, she told herself, trying to calm her racing heart. Just a stupid nightmare. But as she sat there in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a dream, that it was a warning. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just her overactive imagination. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure she could stop it. Victoria got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the night. The town was quiet, the streets empty, but the unease remained. She couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if eyes were lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. She closed the curtains, shutting out the darkness, and went to the kitchen to make herself some tea. Maybe it would help calm her nerves, help her sleep. But even as she sipped the warm liquid, her mind raced with thoughts of the man in the coffee, the shadows in her dream, and the strange sense of foreboding that had settled over her. For the first time in her life, Victoria Harrison felt truly vulnerable. She was alone in a town where no one knew her, where she had no power, no influence. And there was something, or someone, lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. The tea did little to soothe her, and eventually, she gave up on sleep altogether. She sat in the living room, the lights still on, as she stared at the wall, her mind churning with questions and doubts. What had her father been thinking, sending her to this place? Was this his idea of a lesson? To strip her of everything she had known and leave her to fend for herself in a town full of strangers? Or was there something more to it? Something he wasn't telling her? Victoria's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from outside. A soft thud, like something being dropped on the ground. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened intently. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then another thud, closer this time. She crept to the window and peeked through the curtains, her breath catching in her throat. At first, she didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but then she noticed a figure standing across the street, partially hidden by the shadows of a tree. The figure was tall and motionless, watching her apartment. Victoria's blood ran cold. She knew instinctively that it was the same man from the coffee, the one who had unsettled her earlier that day. But what was he doing here, in the middle of the night, just standing there, staring at her? Panic surged through her as she backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she call the police? But what would she say? That some guy was standing outside her apartment, doing nothing? It sounded ridiculous, even to her. But as she glanced back through the curtain, the man was still there, unmoving, like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. Victoria's breath came in shallow gasps as she realized she was trapped, alone in this apartment with no one to turn to. The fear she had been trying to suppress all day now consumed her, tightening around her chest like a vice. She grabbed her phone and dialed Nancy's number, her hands trembling as she waited for the call to connect. It rang once, twice, and then Nancy's groggy voice answered on the other end. "Victoria? What's wrong?" "Nancy, Victoria's voice faltered as she struggled to find the words. "There's someone outside my apartment. I think it's that guy from the coffee. He's just standing there, watching." There was a pause on the other end, and then Nancy's voice came back, steady and reassuring. "Stay calm, Victoria. I'm coming over. Don't go near the windows. Lock your doors and wait for me. Okay?" "Okay," Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," Nancy promised. "Just hold on." Victoria hung up the phone and locked the door, her hands trembling as she turned the deadbolt. She backed away, her heart racing as she tried to keep her breathing under control. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and Victoria nearly jumped out of her skin. She rushed to the door and looked through the peephole, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Nancy's familiar face on the other side. She unlocked the door and pulled it open, her relief palpable as Nancy stepped inside. The older woman quickly shut the door behind her, locking it again before turning to face Victoria. "Are you okay?" Nancy asked, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "I don't know," Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's going on." Nancy put a reassuring hand on Victoria's shoulder. "It's going to be okay. Let's sit down and talk about it." Victoria nodded, feeling a little steadier now that Nancy was there. They sat down on the couch, and Nancy listened as Victoria recounted everything that had happened. The man in the coffee, the dream, the figure outside her apartment. When she finished, Nancy was silent for a moment, as if deep in thought. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Victoria, I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've seen a lot of things. But what you're describing, it's not normal. We need to be careful. I'll stay with you tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out what to do. But for now, just know that you're not alone." Victoria nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. For the first time since she had arrived in Rockport, she felt like someone was on her side, like she wasn't completely adrift in this strange, unsettling place. But even as she tried to take comfort in Nancy's words, the image of the man standing outside her apartment lingered in her mind, a dark shadow that refused to be dispelled. Something was wrong in Rockport, and whatever it was coming for her. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the small apartment. Victoria had barely slept, her mind too restless to find any real peace. Nancy, true to her word, had stayed the night, dozing fitfully in a chair by the window, keeping watch over the quiet street below. When Victoria finally rose, she felt a weariness deep in her bones, a heaviness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She had always been a fighter, someone who could push through anything to get what she wanted. But this was different. This was a fight she hadn't signed up for, a battle against shadows and whispers that she didn't understand. Nancy was already awake, sipping a cup of coffee at the small kitchen table. She looked up as Victoria entered the room, offering her a tired but encouraging smile. "Morning, Victoria. How are you holding up?" Victoria shrugged, heading to the coffee maker to pour herself a cup. "I'm not sure," she admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It still feels like a bad dream." Nancy nodded sympathetically. "I can imagine, but we'll figure this out together. You don't have to go through this alone." Victoria sat down across from Nancy, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. The night's events still played in her mind, every detail vivid and unsettling. The figure outside her apartment, the coldness in his gaze. There was something more to it, something she couldn't shake. "I don't understand what's happening," Victoria said, breaking the silence. "Why is this guy watching me? What does he want?" Nancy took a deep breath, as if considering her words carefully. "I don't know, Victoria, but I think it's time we dig a little deeper. This town, it has its secrets, like any other place. And sometimes, those secrets have a way of creeping into the light." Victoria frowned, her curiosity piqued despite the fear still gnawing at her. "What do you mean? What secrets?" Nancy leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. Rockport might seem like a sleepy little town, but there's more to it than meets the eye. There's history here, things that most people prefer not to talk about. It's not my place to share all of it, but maybe it's time you got to know the town a little better. Victoria felt a flicker of frustration. She was tired of half-answers, tired of being kept in the dark. "Nancy, if there's something I need to know, just tell me. I don't have time for cryptic warnings." Nancy met Victoria's gaze, her expression serious. "I'm not trying to be cryptic, but I don't want to jump to conclusions either. What I do know is that you need to be careful. Whoever that man is, he's not someone you should take lightly." Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing Nancy's words. She had underestimated this place, thinking it was just another small town with nothing to offer. But now, she realized, there was something more to Rockport, something that might be dangerous. "I'll be careful," Victoria promised, "but I'm not going to just sit around and wait for something to happen. I need to know what I'm dealing with." Nancy gave her a look of approval. "That's the spirit. But don't do this alone. If you need help, you ask for it." There are people in this town who can be trusted. Victoria appreciated the support, but she wasn't used to relying on others. She had always prided herself on her independence, on being able to handle anything that came her way. But this was different. This was something she couldn't navigate with just determination and grit. After breakfast, Nancy left to open the coffee, leaving Victoria with a promise to check in on her later. Victoria spent the next hour pacing her apartment, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened, but she also didn't know where to start. Finally, she decided to take a walk around town, hoping that getting out of the apartment might clear her head and give her some perspective. As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted her, a refreshing contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the night before. Rockport was beginning to wake up, the streets slowly filling with locals going about their day. Victoria walked with no particular destination in mind, her thoughts drifting as she took in the quaint charm of the town. Despite the fear still lingering in the back of her mind, there was something oddly peaceful about the place in the daylight. She wandered past the small shops and houses, noting the quiet simplicity of the town. It was so different from the life she had known, so far removed from the fast-paced world of New York. But even as she tried to appreciate the serenity, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the shadows from the night before were still lurking, just out of sight. As she turned a corner, she found herself in front of the Rockport Historical Society, a modest building with a wooden sign hanging above the door. Something about it drew her in, a nagging curiosity that she couldn't ignore. Maybe there were answers here, buried in the town's past. Victoria pushed open the door and stepped inside, the scent of old books and polished wood greeting her. The small lobby was quiet, with a few glass display cases showcasing artifacts from the town's history. Behind the counter sat an older man with thinning gray hair, reading a newspaper. He looked up as Victoria approached, his eyes brightening with curiosity. "Good morning, miss. Can I help you with something?" Victoria hesitated, unsure of how to explain what she was looking for. I'm new in town, and I was wondering if you could tell me a little about Rockport's history." The man smiled warmly, folding his newspaper. "You've come to the right place. Rockport has a rich history, full of interesting stories. Is there something specific you're interested in?" Victoria bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "I've heard there are some things about this town that aren't talked about much. Maybe something related to a mystery or a disappearance." The man's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something, perhaps caution, crossing his face. He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before he spoke. "Rockport has its share of stories, that's for sure, but not all of them are in the history books." Victoria leaned in closer, her curiosity intensifying. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around the empty room, as if checking to make sure they were alone. "There's been talk over the years of things that don't quite add up. People going missing, strange occurrences. Most folks around here prefer not to dig too deep into it. They like to keep things simple." "But you don't?" Victoria pressed, sensing that he might be more open to sharing than others she had met. He gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news." Let's just say I've always had an interest in the parts of history that others might overlook. If you're really interested in learning more, there are some old records in the back that might shed some light on what you're looking for. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. This was the first real lead she had, the first crack in the wall of secrecy that seemed to surround the town. "I'd appreciate that," she said, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. The man nodded and stood up, motioning for her to follow him. He led her through a narrow hallway to a small, cluttered room at the back of the building. There, shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, files, and dusty boxes. "This is where we keep the older records," he explained, gesturing to the shelves. "Some of these documents go back over 100 years. You're welcome to look through them, but I'd appreciate it if you'd handle them with care." "Of course," Victoria agreed, already scanning the shelves for anything that might stand out. The man left her to her task, and Victoria quickly immersed herself in the stacks of old papers and files. Hours passed as she sifted through records of births, deaths, land deeds, and town meetings. Most of it was mundane, the day-to-day details of a small town's history. But then, buried in a box of old newspapers, she found something that made her pause. It was a yellowed article, dated nearly 30 years ago, with the headline, "Local Teen Goes Missing. Search Continues." Victoria's pulse quickened as she read the article. It detailed the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl named Emily Sanders, who had vanished without a trace one evening after leaving her job at the very same coffee where Victoria now worked. The search had gone on for weeks, but no clues were ever found, and eventually, the case had gone cold. There was something eerie about the story, something that struck too close to home. The description of the girl, the circumstances of her disappearance, it all felt too familiar, too similar to what Victoria had experienced last night. She read on, her unease growing with each word. The article mentioned that Emily had been seen talking to a stranger in the days leading up to her disappearance, a man no one in town could identify. The police had questioned everyone, but the man had seemingly vanished, just like Emily. Victoria's hands trembled as she placed the article back in the box. There was no mention of the case ever being solved, no resolution for Emily or her family. It was as if she had been erased from the town's history, another dark secret buried beneath the surface. But now, Victoria had uncovered it, and as she stood there in the dusty room, the weight of what she had found pressed down on her, a cold realization settling in. The shadows she had felt, the unease that had gnawed at her since arriving in Rockport. It wasn't just in her head. There was something here, something that had been hidden for years, and it was starting to creep back into the light. And now, Victoria was part of it. With a shaky breath, she left the room and made her way back to the front of the building. The old man was back at his desk, reading his newspaper as if nothing had happened. Victoria hesitated, wondering if she should say something, but in the end, she decided against it. She wasn't ready to share what she had found. Not yet. As she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the town seemed unchanged, as if the darkness she had uncovered hadn't touched it at all. But Victoria knew better. She knew that the shadows were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. And she knew that she couldn't ignore them any longer. Whatever had happened to Emily Sanders, whatever had drawn that stranger to her apartment last night, it was all connected. And Victoria was determined to find out how, no matter the cost. Victoria's thoughts swirled as she walked back to the coffee. The revelation about Emily Sanders clung to her like a dark cloud, and each step felt heavier than the last. She had come to Rockport expecting to be bored, annoyed, maybe even humbled. But this was something she could never have anticipated. When she reached the coffee, Nancy was busy behind the counter, serving a couple of regulars. The warmth of the coffee, with its familiar scent of coffee and pastries, should have been comforting. But today, it felt different. The cozy atmosphere seemed at odds with the tension Victoria felt brewing inside her. Nancy noticed Victoria's return and gave her a quick, concerned glance. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Victoria hesitated. Part of her wanted to spill everything she had discovered, to unload the weight of it onto someone else. But another part of her held back. She wasn't sure how Nancy would react, and she didn't want to jump to conclusions or drag her into something dangerous. "Yeah," Victoria lied, forcing a smile. "Just learning more about the town. It's got an interesting history." Nancy didn't seem entirely convinced, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, if you ever want to talk about it, you know where to find me," she said, her tone friendly but with a hint of concern that she couldn't quite hide. "Thanks," Victoria replied, her smile faltering as she walked past the counter to the back of the coffee, where she could be alone with her thoughts. She needed time to process everything, to figure out what her next move should be. Sitting down at one of the empty tables, she pulled out her phone and began searching for any more information on Emily Sanders' case. She didn't find much, just a few old news articles, all of which repeated the same details she had already read in the archive. It seemed that the town, and perhaps the world, had forgotten about Emily. But Victoria couldn't forget. Not now. She knew she had to dig deeper. The question was how. She needed to find someone who knew more, someone who had lived in Rockport at the time of Emily's disappearance and could fill in the gaps the newspapers had left out. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Nancy had been in Rockport for years, maybe even when Emily went missing. But if she hadn't mentioned anything by now, it might be because she didn't want to talk about it. Pushing her for answers could strain the fragile trust they had built. And then there was Margaret, the elderly woman she had met in the park. Margaret seemed to know a lot about the town's history, and there had been something in her eyes, something that hinted at a deeper understanding of Rockport's darker side. Perhaps she could be the key to uncovering more. Victoria made up her mind. She would find Margaret again and see if she could learn more about what had really happened to Emily Sanders. The rest of the day dragged on slowly. The coffee wasn't particularly busy, and Victoria found herself constantly distracted, her thoughts drifting back to the mystery she was now entangled in. By the time her shift ended, she was itching to get out, to take the next step in her search for answers. She left the coffee as soon as she could, feeling a sense of urgency she hadn't experienced before. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town as she made her way to the park where she had first met Margaret. The air was cool, and the streets were quiet, with only a few people out and about. When she reached the park, she scanned the area, hoping to spot Margaret sitting on the same bench. But the park was nearly empty, save for a couple of kids playing in the distance and an elderly man walking his dog. Disappointment settled in, but Victoria wasn't ready to give up. She walked through the park, hoping to find some sign of Margaret, but there was nothing. Maybe she had come at the wrong time, or maybe Margaret wasn't the type to stick to a routine. As she was about to leave, she noticed a small gathering of people near the park's edge, where a few food vendors had set up carts. They were chatting casually, enjoying the last light of the day. Among them, Victoria spotted a familiar face. It was Margaret. Victoria felt a surge of relief as she approached the group, her heart pounding in her chest. Margaret was talking to a vendor, smiling as she accepted a small paper bag. When she noticed Victoria approaching, her smile widened. "Victoria, what a pleasant surprise," Margaret said warmly, holding up the bag. "Care for a snack? These fried dough balls are the best in town." Victoria returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe later. I was hoping we could talk. Somewhere quiet." Margaret's expression shifted slightly, a hint of curiosity and concern flickering across her face. "Of course," she said, nodding toward a bench away from the others. "Let's sit down." They walked over to the bench and sat, the soft rustle of leaves and distant laughter of children the only sounds around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria wasn't sure how to begin. "I found something today," Victoria started, her voice low, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "In the archives at the Historical Society. It's about a girl who went missing years ago. Emily Sanders." Margaret's face remained calm, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes, a subtle sign that the name was familiar to her. "Emily," she repeated softly. "Yes, I remember her. It was a terrible tragedy." Victoria leaned in, her pulse quickening. "What happened to her, Margaret?" "The articles I found didn't say much, and it feels like everyone in town just forgot about her." Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting to the ground. "It's not that people forgot, Victoria. It's that they chose to forget. It was easier that way." "What do you mean?" Victoria pressed, feeling the tension build between them. Margaret looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something deeper. Regret, perhaps. Emily's disappearance shook this town to its core. She was a bright girl, full of life, and then she was just gone. The police searched for weeks, but there were no leads, no clues. It was as if she vanished into thin air. Victoria's throat tightened. But there was something else, wasn't there? Something the papers didn't report. Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. There were rumors, whispers about a stranger who had been seen around town before Emily disappeared. No one knew who he was or where he came from, but people said he was unsettling. There were stories about how he had spoken to Emily, how he had been seen lingering near the coffee where she worked, but nothing concrete, nothing the police could act on. Victoria's mind raced. "And you think this stranger had something to do with what happened to her?" Margaret's eyes locked onto Victoria's, her voice quiet but firm. "I do. But like I said, nothing was ever proven. And after a while, people stopped talking about it. It was too painful, too frightening. It was easier to pretend it never happened. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. But what if this stranger is back? What if he's the same man who came into the coffee yesterday? Margaret's expression darkened, and she reached out to grasp Victoria's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. If that's true, then you need to be very careful, Victoria. Whoever he is, he's dangerous. And if he's come back after all these years, it's not by coincidence. Victoria's mouth went dry. What should I do? Margaret held her gaze, her voice steady and full of warning. You keep your distance. Don't let him know you're onto him. And whatever you do, don't trust him. If he's watching you, there's a reason. But you need to stay one step ahead. Victoria nodded, trying to process everything. The weight of what she had uncovered felt heavier now, more real. She had stumbled into something far bigger than she had anticipated. Something dark and dangerous that had been lurking in the shadows of this town for decades. And now, it was her problem to solve. Thank you, Margaret, Victoria said quietly, squeezing the older woman's hand. I appreciate your help. Margaret nodded, her expression softening. You're a strong young woman, Victoria. Don't let this town break you. Remember, you're not alone. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. Finally, Victoria stood up, her mind made up. She had come to Rockport to escape her old life, but now she realized there was no escaping this. She was in too deep, and she couldn't turn back. As she walked away from the park, the shadows lengthening around her, Victoria knew one thing for certain. She would find out what happened to Emily Sanders, and she would make sure that whatever, or whoever, had taken her wouldn't get the chance to do it again. But she also knew that in doing so, she was walking straight into the heart of a darkness she barely understood. And there was no telling what she might find. As the night enveloped Rockport, Victoria returned to her apartment with a mix of determination and dread. Margaret's warning echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the danger she now faced. The town, once quaint and unassuming, felt like a maze of secrets, each corner hiding something darker than the last. After locking the door behind her, Victoria sank into the small couch in her living room, her mind spinning with thoughts of Emily Sanders and the mysterious stranger who had reappeared in her life. There was a connection, she was sure of it, but the pieces weren't fitting together. Not yet. She pulled out her phone and began to search again, this time with a more focused intent. If the police hadn't been able to solve Emily's case, maybe there were other sources, old forums, local message boards, anything that might have information the official records lacked. Hours passed as Victoria combed through the digital landscape, her eyes scanning countless pages of forgotten corners of the internet. Most of it was noise, speculation, dead-end theories, conspiracy posts that led nowhere. But just as she was about to give up, a comment on an obscure forum caught her attention. It was buried deep in a thread about unsolved mysteries in small towns, a post from over a decade ago. The user claimed to have lived in Rockport at the time of Emily's disappearance and mentioned something that hadn't been in the articles or Margaret's recounting. There were always whispers about the old Willow Creek Road, the place where they say the girl was last seen. People said they heard strange things at night, saw lights in the woods. The police never found anything, but those who went looking said they felt something out there, something watching. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. Willow Creek Road. She had driven past it on her first day in Rockport, a narrow, winding road that led into the woods on the outskirts of town. It had looked harmless enough then, just another stretch of rural backroad. But now, it felt like a missing piece of the puzzle. Without hesitating, Victoria grabbed her jacket and car keys. She knew it was reckless, driving out there alone at night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was where she needed to be. If there were answers to be found, they would be out there, hidden in the shadows of Willow Creek. The drive was short, but it felt longer as the darkness pressed in around her. The town faded behind her, replaced by the dense forest that lined the road. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying in the wind like silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the woods. Victoria slowed as she approached the turnoff to Willow Creek Road, her headlights illuminating the weathered sign. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and turned onto the road. The pavement soon gave way to gravel, the car jostling as she drove deeper into the forest. The farther she went, the narrower the road became, until it was little more than a dirt path. She came to a stop at what looked like the end of the road, a small clearing surrounded by trees. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Victoria's nerves were on edge, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to get out of there while she still could. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped out of the car, the chill in the air biting through her jacket. The darkness was thick here, the trees blocking out what little light the moon offered. She pulled out her phone, using the flashlight to cut through the gloom as she began to explore the area. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks jutting out from the dirt. As she walked, her light caught on something, a glint of metal among the leaves. She bent down to pick it up, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what it was. A locket, old and tarnished, the clasp broken. It felt cold in her hand, and she carefully opened it, revealing a faded photograph inside. The image was blurry, but Victoria could just make out the smiling face of a young girl. It had to be Emily. This locket was hers, lost, or perhaps discarded, all those years ago. Victoria's pulse quickened. She had found something real. But what did it mean? Had Emily been here the night she disappeared? Had she dropped the locket in a struggle? Or had it been placed here deliberately? A sudden noise snapped Victoria out of her thoughts, rustling in the bushes, too loud to be the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand as she scanned the trees. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper, the sound swallowed by the darkness. There was no response, but the rustling continued, growing closer. Victoria's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone out here. Someone, or something, was watching her. She backed away slowly, the locket clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes darting around the clearing. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that only heightened her fear. And then, she saw it. A shadowy figure at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, into the faint light of her phone. It was the man from the coffee, his face obscured by the brim of his baseball cap, his posture tense and predatory. For a moment, they stared at each other, neither moving. Victoria's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. She could feel the weight of the locket in her hand, its cold metal pressing against her palm. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound brave. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. Then, without a word, he took another step forward. Victoria's heart pounded in her ears as she realized she couldn't stay here. She had to run. Without thinking, she turned and bolted for the car, the locket slipping from her grasp as she fumbled with her keys. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, getting closer, the sound of leaves crunching under his boots. She reached the car, her hands shaking as she unlocked the door and threw herself inside. She jammed the key into the ignition, her breath coming in panicked gasps as the engine roared to life. But just as she was about to drive away, the man reached the car. His hand slammed against the window, the force of it sending a spiderweb of cracks through the glass. Victoria screamed, throwing the car into reverse and slamming her foot on the gas. The car lurched backward, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as she sped away from the clearing. She didn't dare look back, her eyes fixed on the road ahead as she navigated the narrow path, the trees whipping past in a blur. Finally, she reached the main road and floored the accelerator, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart was still racing, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The man hadn't just been watching her, he had been waiting for her. As she drove back toward town, the locket's image burned in her mind. She had been so close to uncovering something that connected Emily Sanders to the man who had nearly caught her tonight. But now, all she had were more questions and a chilling reminder that she was in over her head. When she finally reached her apartment, she parked the car and sat in silence, trying to calm her frayed nerves. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She stumbled inside, locking the door behind her and double-checking it for good measure. She couldn't stay here, she realized. Not alone. Not after what had just happened. She needed help, but who could she trust? Nancy, she decided. Nancy would know what to do. Victoria grabbed her phone and dialed Nancy's number, her hands still shaking. The phone rang twice before Nancy picked up, her voice groggy with sleep. Victoria? What's going on? Are you okay? Nancy, Victoria's voice cracked. The fear she had been holding back all night finally spilling over. I think someone tried to hurt me. I was out at Willow Creek Road, and he was there, the man from the coffee. He chased me. I barely got away. There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of rustling as Nancy sat up. Stay where you are. I'm coming over right now. Don't open the door for anyone but me, okay? Okay, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. I'll be there soon, Nancy promised, and then the line went dead. Victoria sank onto the couch, hugging her knees to her chest as she waited. The apartment felt too quiet, too still, and every creak of the building sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She couldn't stop thinking about the man, the way he had watched her, the force of his hand against the car window. What had she gotten herself into? And what did it have to do with Emily Sanders? When Nancy finally arrived, Victoria let her in, the relief of seeing a familiar face almost overwhelming. Nancy didn't ask questions right away. Instead, she guided Victoria to the kitchen, made her a cup of tea, and sat with her at the table. Tell me everything, Nancy said quietly, her eyes full of concern. Victoria took a deep breath and began to recount the night's events, from the discovery of the locket to the terrifying encounter with the man in the woods. Nancy listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. When Victoria finished, there was a heavy silence between them. Nancy looked down at the table, her brows furrowed in thought. I was afraid of this, she finally said, her voice low. I didn't want to believe it, but it's clear now that something's happening. Something that's been buried for too long. What do you mean? Victoria asked, her fear laced with frustration. What's going on in this town, Nancy? What aren't you telling me? Nancy sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. It's not just about Emily Sanders, Victoria. There's a pattern, one that's been happening for years. Every so often, someone goes missing. Always under strange circumstances, always with whispers of a stranger being involved. The police never find anything, and eventually, the town just moves on. It's like the people here have come to accept it as part of life, even if they don't talk about it. Victoria's stomach churned. But why? Why does this keep happening? I don't know, Nancy admitted, her voice heavy with regret, but I've seen enough to know that it's not coincidence. There's something wrong here, something that goes deeper than any of us understand. And if that man is involved, then you're in more danger than I realized. Victoria's mind reeled. Everything she had uncovered, Emily's disappearance, the locket, the man in the woods, it was all connected to something far bigger, far darker than she had ever imagined. So what do we do? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nancy looked at her, determination hardening in her eyes. We fight back. We find out what's really going on, and we stop it before anyone else gets hurt. Victoria nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. She wasn't going to run from this. She had come to Rockport to escape her old life, but now, she realized, she had found a new purpose, a fight worth taking on, no matter the cost. But as they sat there, plotting their next move, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The man in the woods had been real, tangible, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. An unseen presence that had been lurking in the shadows since the moment she arrived in Rockport, and it was getting closer. The morning after the storm, Victoria and Nancy prepared to dig deeper into the mystery. Armed with the unsettling knowledge of the mark of the Watcher, they felt the urgency of their mission. The weight of what they had uncovered, the connection between Emily Sanders, the dark symbol, and the mysterious man, was almost suffocating. Their first stop was John Weaver's house, the former sheriff who had overseen the investigation into Emily's disappearance. He greeted them with a tired nod, sensing the seriousness of their visit. Emily's case never left me, John admitted as they sat on his porch. There was always something off about it, something we couldn't see. When Victoria mentioned the strange man who had been seen around Emily, John's expression darkened. "I remember him. There were rumors, whispers of a stranger. We tried to find him, but he vanished as soon as we got close." John then handed Victoria a sketch he had kept hidden for years. It depicted a symbol carved into a tree near Willow Creek, where Emily had last been seen. A circle with intricate patterns and a cross at its center. "I found this after Emily disappeared," John explained. "It wasn't there before. I believe it's connected to whatever happened to her." Victoria studied the sketch, recognizing it as the mark of the Watcher. The symbol, linked to ancient rituals and dark forces, was now inextricably tied to Emily's fate, and possibly her own. Back in town, they headed to the library, searching for any information on the symbol. After hours of digging through old books, Victoria found a match in a dusty tome titled Symbols of the Forgotten. The text described the mark of the Watcher as an ancient sigil used by a secretive cult. The cult was rumored to summon a malevolent entity, binding it to specific locations, often near water or deep in the woods. "This symbol is at the heart of everything," Victoria whispered, showing the passage to Nancy. "It's why he's here." Nancy's face paled. "Then we need to go back to Willow Creek. If that's where the Watcher was bound, there might be more clues out there." Despite the growing fear in the pit of her stomach, Victoria agreed. They had to face whatever awaited them in the woods. As they approached Willow Creek, the mist thickened, and the forest closed in around them. Victoria's pulse quickened as she searched for the symbol. When she found it, faintly carved into an ancient tree, a cold dread settled over her. The Watcher's presence was palpable, a malevolent force lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, the man who had been haunting her. Frozen in place, Victoria realized they were no longer just searching for answers. They were being hunted. The drive to Willow Creek was tense, the weight of the recent discoveries heavy on Victoria and Nancy. The mark of the Watcher had given them a name for the darkness they were facing, but it also brought a deeper sense of dread. They were confronting something ancient and malevolent, tied to dark rituals and disappearances. The narrow road leading to Willow Creek wound through the dense forest, mist clinging to the trees like a shroud. The air grew colder as they approached the clearing where Victoria had first encountered the mysterious man. The memory of that night, of the fear that had gripped her as she fled, was still fresh, but this time, she was determined not to run. Nancy parked at the edge of the clearing, and they stepped out into the eerie silence. The mist swirled around them, making the forest feel alive and watchful. Victoria pulled out the sketch John Weaver had given them, comparing it to the faint carving on a nearby tree. The mark of the Watcher was there, worn but unmistakable. "We're close," Victoria whispered, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. This was the place where Emily had vanished, where the Watcher had been summoned or bound. The air felt charged with a malevolent energy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes behind her. Victoria spun around, her heart racing, but the mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. The forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the pounding of her heart. "Nancy," she called, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of her own breathing and the rustling that seemed to circle her. Panic surged, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to find Nancy and get out of these woods. Then, out of the mist, the shadowy figure emerged, the man who had been stalking her. His face was hidden by the brim of his hat, but his presence was unmistakable, radiating cold menace. Victoria's fear rooted her to the spot, her mind racing for an escape. But before she could react, Nancy's voice cut through the fog. "Victoria, run!" The command broke Victoria's paralysis, and she bolted toward Nancy's voice, crashing through the underbrush. The man's footsteps pounded behind her, closer with every second. She didn't dare look back, her only focus on reaching Nancy and the safety of their car. Bursting into the clearing, she saw Nancy frantically waving her over. They both jumped into the car just as the man appeared at the edge of the trees. Nancy floored the gas, sending them speeding away, but Victoria could still feel his gaze, cold and relentless, following them. As they raced back to town, Victoria knew the danger was far from over. The Watcher was real, and its dark power was growing, and it was coming for her. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a gray, oppressive sky over Rockport. Victoria stood by the window, her mind swirling with the implications of the night before. She and Nancy had uncovered the mark of the Watcher, confirming that an ancient, malevolent force was at work in the town. But this knowledge brought with it an overwhelming sense of dread. Nancy arrived early, her face set with determination despite the fear lingering in her eyes. They knew they couldn't stop now. The answers they sought were buried somewhere in the dark history of Rockport, and they had to find them before it was too late. Their first stop was John Weaver's house. The former sheriff, who had overseen the investigation into Emily Sanders' disappearance, greeted them with a weary nod. The case had never left him, and he could see the urgency in their faces. Victoria showed John the sketch of the symbol they had found in the woods. John's expression darkened as he studied it. "This symbol, it's been haunting me for years," he admitted. "I found it carved into a tree near where Emily disappeared. It was like a marker, left behind by someone, or something." John's words only deepened Victoria's unease. The symbol wasn't just a random carving. It was a deliberate sign, tied to a cult that had long been forgotten. The mark of the Watcher, as described in the book they had found, was connected to dark rituals meant to summon or bind a powerful, malevolent entity. "We need to understand what this symbol means," Nancy said. "If we can figure that out, maybe we can stop whatever's happening." John nodded, his face grim. "But be careful. This isn't just some old superstition. If the Watcher is real, you're dealing with something far more dangerous than you can imagine." Victoria felt the weight of his warning as they left his house and headed back to Willow Creek Road. This time, they were determined to uncover whatever secrets the forest held, no matter the cost. As they reached the clearing where Victoria had encountered the mysterious man, the air grew colder and the mist thickened around them. The mark of the Watcher was faint but still visible on a tree, a chilling reminder of the dark forces at play. But before they could investigate further, the man emerged from the mist, his presence as menacing as ever. Victoria's heart pounded as he moved toward them, his intentions clear. "Run!" Nancy shouted, grabbing Victoria's arm. They sprinted through the forest, the man close behind, his footsteps echoing through the trees. Fear fueled their flight, but the oppressive presence of the Watcher seemed to close in around them. When they finally reached their car and sped away, Victoria looked back and saw the man watching them from the edge of the woods. The Watcher's influence was growing, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed what it wanted. Victoria knew that the fight was just beginning, and the real darkness had yet to come. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.